What's going on, guys? I hope you're all doing great. My name is PJ. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about a very important book in my life that I have recently just fully read. I have talked about it previously as I just like the bits and pieces of this book that I had read, because this is a very heavy book. It is a very deep book, and I believe that it's hard for anyone really, even regardless of if you've had or have or suffer from post-traumatic stress or not, to read all the traumatic accounts that this book mentions. But nonetheless, even in my bits and pieces of reading of this book in the past, I had gained so much value from it. But for the purpose of creating this video and sharing with you the learnings from this book, because I do believe it's immensely valuable, and the more and more people that I speak to that have suffered from trauma, I can't help myself but to recommend this book to. And so I felt like it's time for me to finally do a deep dive in this book and share all my learnings from it with you. So the book in discussion today is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Van Der Kolk. He is, I believe, from the Netherlands, and he is a doctor who practices and has been practicing, and I believe has a center or facility of healing people and helping them overcome trauma and deal with what he says is his essential goal, is helping them deal with the residues of past trauma. And he does that fantastically in this book. And this book has helped, I believe at this point, since it's been published now 10 years ago in 2014, I believe it has helped most likely millions of people at this point, and he has personally helped thousands of people in his personal practice and in his life, and through the facility that he has and through the other physicians who he has trained to help patients heal from trauma. And he has had a lot of experiential knowledge to help people heal from trauma, whereas I think a lot of the previous literature on healing trauma, before he really tries to become a practitioner of healing trauma, a lot of the literature were more just like theoretical discussions versus hands-on and learned knowledge through application of trying to actually be a physician and heal people who are suffering from PTSD. And that's how he has gained a lot of his knowledge in his life, is actually dealing with patients, actually being a practitioner, and actually trying to bring healing to the lives of those who are suffering from trauma. So I want to start the actual book review section of this book, or sharing the key summaries from this book, with two quotes that I heard and read in this book, which I listened to audiobook, so I heard in this book. And those two quotes are as followed: "Our bodies are the texts that carry the memories, and therefore remembering is no less than reincarnation." That is from Katie Cannon. The second quote is, "Traumatic stress is an illness of not being able to be fully alive in the present." And that's by Pierre Genet. So before we start and really get into the meat and the potatoes of this discussion about this book, I'm going to share some statistics with you that to me highlight the need for a book such as this. Keep in mind, these statistics are from 10 years ago. The book came out in 2014. They are from 2014 as well. So that's 10 years ago, as I'm making this video in 2024. So I believe with everything that has happened since then, the pandemic and many other things, people's lives have become more stressful since then, since 2014. And so I think therefore, due to that increased stress, the rate of these numbers have probably been inflated and increased since then, possibly drastically, which is unfortunate to say, but I do believe these numbers are probably higher at this point. So I'm going to list 5 different statistics with you. So here they go. 1 in 5 people have been sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 were beaten until a mark was left on their bodies. 1 in 3 couples engage in physical violence. And 1/4, a quarter of us grew up with alcoholic relatives. And lastly, 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother being beaten or hit. So now, with those statistics mentioned, I think it's very clear why we would need a book such as The Body Keeps the Score. So without further ado, The Body keeps the score. So this first section is going to be all about what is trauma. Just as Bessel Van Der Kolk has dedicated the first section of his book, The Body Keeps the Score, to what is trauma, we're going to follow the same template and the same theme and structure in this video. So without much more introduction about the outline of the video and the outline of the book, here we go into the first section of the book and the video, which is what is trauma. This first section of the book is a very tough read. It was a very tough read for me, and I can't even imagine how tough it would be for some people who have possibly experienced similar things or maybe exactly the same things as some of the people and some of the stories that are recounted in this first section of the book, because this first section of the book is entirely dedicated to sharing trauma accounts and people's trauma stories, basically how they got their PTSD. And it's a very tough read, and like I said, I think it would be a very challenging part to get through for those who have experienced some of these traumas, or honestly any trauma, or honestly anyone, honestly without even no trauma, right? Like it's just a very disturbing and challenging part to read. However, I think it's very important to set the stage for what is to come next and what is this book is about, which is healing trauma. So one thing about reading this section of the book is that as much as I believe that this book would help everyone, I do think that not everyone should read it if they're not ready for it. And one point that the author reiterates over and over again in this book, that until you have reached a stage where you would not be re-traumatized by revisiting your trauma, you should not try to revisit it, because by all means, you want to avoid the possibility of getting re-traumatized by revisiting your trauma too early before you're fully ready to do it. So for that reason alone, I say that if everyone's not ready possibly to read this book yet, or if you're going to read this book and you're not yet ready or have reached that stage where you're ready for it, but still want to read this book, I do recommend that you skip the first section of this book, as important as it is, as potentially helpful as it could be. Maybe if you're not ready for it and you're not at that stage yet, maybe skip, but still want to read this book, maybe skip this first section, which is all about recounting trauma, going through other people's trauma stories and sharing those with you. So I highly recommend, if you have not reached that stage yet, that you skip this first part of the book and just go to section 2, which is more so about healing trauma and not necessarily as much about what is trauma or what is PTSD. So here are 3 things that Bessel Van Der Kolk mentions in this book that I think you should know about trauma. Number 1, you don't have to go through combat to experience trauma. Number 2, trauma impacts not only those directly exposed to it or those directly experiencing it, but also indirectly those who are around them. And number 3, culture shapes our expression of traumatic stress, which I do think is a very interesting point, that you could suffer trauma in different cultures. However, the expression of that trauma may look different based on how trauma, let's say, or post-traumatic stress is appropriately, to just use that word, appropriately, is expressed through the norms of that particular culture in discussion. Now, here are some things that I think you should know about the author of this book, or Bessel Van Der Kolk. So the author, Bessel Van Der Kolk, he always felt that cracking the code to healing trauma was to figure out, and is dependent on figuring out, how the whole human organism works. And this kind of understanding, or this realization of his, later led to him understanding and trying to understand and studying the role of our bodies in healing trauma and in trauma in general, how they experience trauma, how they deal with trauma, how they react to trauma, and how they also help in healing trauma. This whole focus of his of understanding how the whole, or rather a realization. I think when he was a student still in college, he just felt intuitively, he had the understanding that unless he understands how the whole human organism works, he's not going to understand how to heal trauma or really heal any sort of ailment for that matter. So that's what kind of led to his, you could say, obsession or his dedication or his focus on figuring out not just the role of the mind, which previously, primarily before his emphasis or his studying or his practice of healing trauma, it was more so about how can we use the mind, to heal that and overcome trauma and post-traumatic stress. But his realization and his intuitive kind of nudge that we have to understand how the whole human organism works to bring healing, that's what led to him really focusing on the role of the body, which then led to him writing the book The Body Keeps the Score, and explaining the role of the body in expressing and also healing trauma. Now, I've also previously mentioned this point about what was his goal. What was Bessel Van Der Kolk's goal with this book, with writing this book? And it was, as he states in the book, it is to help people overcome the residues of past trauma. Now, the last point I want to make about the author Bessel Van Der Kolk is that he practices all the forms of healing, all the different modalities and treatments of healing trauma that he mentions in the book. However, he doesn't have just one preferred method that he always goes back to per se. He uses different methods at different stages of healing for people, but also based on the different circumstances that each patient might have experienced and have gone through and got those residues of trauma due to that experience. So he will change his approach due to the particular nature of each patient's traumatic stress. So that is also an important note to note before we go further in the video and before we get further into the book. So there's this one story that Bessel Van Der Kolk shares in The Body Keeps the Score that really caught my attention. And basically what this story does is the story of a kid who was in New York. He was in school. He was like, I think 5 years old, and he was in class, he was in school, and in New York on 9/11, and through the window of his classroom, he could even see the events that are taking place, the planes and the buildings, coming down and people jumping out and all the trauma associated with that. He was able to see that. And this is like a family friend of Bessel Van Der Kolk's, and he's friends with this kid's parents. And this is a story that he shares about how this one kid dealt with what he saw and I want to say, experience on that day, even though he wasn't directly there, fortunately for him. But he, still, as all of us did, I think everywhere in the world, we experienced that event in different ways. But this story of this particular kid encapsulates really well how this one kid was able to kind of swerve, for lack of a better word, and dodge being traumatized by this experience. And I think that it's very impactful just to see the lessons encapsulated in this one kid's approach on how to use your mind, how to go about reframing, positioning a traumatic experience to, in his case, prevent trauma, but then in the opposite case, what would cause trauma. So I think it's really interesting to do a deep analysis on this simple story. So the story goes as this. There's this 5-year-old kid, and he's in school in New York City on the day of the 9/11 events. And he, through the window of his classroom, can see that, the planes are flying into the buildings, that people are jumping out of the burning building, and eventually, the building's coming down, which was traumatizing for everyone. But basically later that day, or later the next day, Bessel Van Der Kolk is at this kid's parents' house, and he's hanging out there, and they're his friends, and he sees that this kid the next day of the 9/11 incident had made a drawing. And basically what this drawing could, clearly was portraying were the two buildings on fire. There were people jumping out of the building. But the difference and something that was in the painting, in the drawing, that Bessel didn't know what that is, was a big circle at the bottom of the buildings. And so a big like black circle at the bottom of the buildings that this kid had drew on this, painting. And so Bessel Van Der Kolk asks him, hey, what is that circle at the bottom? And the kid says, that's an invention of his that he wants to create. And basically what it is, it's a giant trampoline, so that next time something like that happens, people won't suffer the same fate, those who unfortunately jumped out of the buildings and lost their lives, and everyone who lost their lives, but in particular those who were jumping out of the building, so that safety net, so to speak, that trampoline catches them. And Bessel was really amazed at just this one kid's ability to use his imagination to go into action mode, go into solution mode. And so what is the lesson in that? Well, one lesson is about the role of imagination and the role of being able to reframe situations to avoid certain post-traumatic stresses that could be caused and brought about as a result of what you experience. But also not just that, more importantly, it's about the role that action or lack thereof plays in whether or not we suffer and experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or not. And so this kid, on the day of 9/11, not only, unfortunately for him, was able to take action to get out of that situation. So he saw it, he wasn't there, good for him. And he was able to, his parents come and pick him up from the school, take him home. So he's able to take action in that regard to avoid the situation. But also he's able to then later use his imagination and action of the imagination and come up with a solution and go into action mode. So what is the lesson in that? The lesson in that is that PTSD could be avoided in most cases, or a lot of cases, through action that a person was able to take in response to that traumatic event or that experience that they were having that was traumatizing. So it's action in a lot of cases that decides if someone gets traumatized or not. And what I mean by that is most PTSD is caused by situations where someone was in a traumatic experience, in a horrible situation such as 9/11, but could not take action in response to that. The inability to act and take action in the face of that experience is what in a lot of cases causes PTSD. When a person couldn't take action in the face of the traumatic experience that they were suffering from. That's what causes PTSD in a lot of the cases, is the inability to take action in the face of what is happening in the moment. Now, in the case of this kid in particular, and the lesson that we can gain from that is the role of action, but also a caveat, the role of stress hormones in helping us avoid developing or suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder by fueling action. That's what the proper role of stress hormones in our bodies is, to fuel us to act in the face of trauma, in the face of stressful events, and through that action, swerve off, avoid, dodge developing PTSD. So this kid was able to, in this one story, this 5-year-old kid in his 5-year-old life, in this one story, in this one case study, was able to encapsulate the benefits of being able to take action in the face of trauma, and then using your imagination to reframe the situation to avoid trauma. So the reason I wanted to start with that case study as our basis for understanding trauma is because I believe it encapsulates a lot of things that Bessel Van Der Kolk says and wants to say and teach about trauma, the experience of trauma, the development of PTSD, and so on and so forth. So I thought it was a very powerful story. And I do think that maybe it is important to teach our kids. I don't have kids, but I'm saying when I do have kids, based on what I've learned from this book, to teach our children how to use and develop skills to be able to be calm under stress and be able to also act in the face of stressful situations, take action, but also how to use their imagination, not to like gaslight themselves or use their imagination to cover up genuinely horrendous experiences, but also use their imagination, be able to reframe situations in their minds in a way that's helpful for them to survive, but also to just use it as a skill set of how they can use their imagination, because it's a very powerful tool in our toolbox to reframe undesirable situations per se in a way that they see the benefit of it. And like one simple case or one simple way to encapsulate this, I think, is something that I've heard Tony Robbins say, I've heard other motivational speakers say, but it's just this general quote of, things are not happening to me, they're happening for me. And I think that one thing alone can help us use our imagination for reframing situations in a way that's more truly helpful to us, versus things are happening to me, but rather to reframe that to things are happening for me. I think that one tactic of using our imagination for reframing situations could help us tremendously in life. And in this case, in case of a 5-year-old child who's going through the traumatic stress that could have left a lot more residues of trauma on him, but being able to use his reframing ability, his imagination to navigate that situation better, and also his ability to act in the face of that experience, that helps him avoid that trauma. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that and gained from that, and something that we can teach ourselves and learn from ourselves, but also teach others and teach our children, and so on and so forth. So now on to another story that I believe could be a much more relatable story of how we could experience trauma and develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So this story is absolutely crazy. However, I think it could be a much more relatable story of something that we could potentially and unfortunately experience in our lives that could be much more easy to comprehend than some of the more inexcusable examples shared in the book. So the story goes as followed. The story is about a patient who underwent a surgery, and while they were going through the surgery, the anesthetics did not work. I mean, they worked in regards and in terms of making that person look asleep and look, immobile, and they were not moving and they were not able to move. However, they were feeling everything. And apparently, this is terrifying, but apparently this happens. And I remember not a few years ago, a long time ago, maybe in like 2007, there was a movie called Awake, and I think it starred Jessica Alba or something. And this movie was about this exact scenario, and I remember watching that and it terrified me years ago. But it is something that happens, and the reason I wanted to bring up this particular story is because I do believe it encapsulates everything that we just talked about and learned about how trauma forms from the previous story. But better than that per se is that I think this is something that could be much more relatable, because all of us could more easily put ourselves in the shoes of someone experiencing this and realize how traumatizing it could be for us to undergo a surgery while awake practically. But also I think it's something that could be more relatable than some of the more inexcusable stories shared in the book, that for someone who hasn't experienced trauma, fortunately for them, they may be able to relate to this story more and put themselves in the shoes of this person more easily and understand the effects of trauma, how post-traumatic stress disorder forms for themselves, and through that learn from that and relate to that. So that's why I wanted to share that story. So this story has all the hallmarks based on the previous story that we mentioned and learned from. This story has all the hallmarks of what causes trauma and how trauma forms. So this person is undergoing a traumatic experience. Literally, trauma is being inflicted on their body. They're being cut apart, basically, right? They're being cut into, which is a traumatic experience. It's an actual horrible incident, right? However, they can't do anything in the face of this experience, which has the hallmark of how trauma forms. So that story is the perfect recipe for developing trauma. Trauma, a painful experience, a stressful experience being inflicted upon you and to you, and you not being able to take any action in the face of that stressful event, in the face of that experience. You want to cause post-traumatic stress disorder? Here you go. That's the perfect recipe. That has all the hallmarks on how to develop trauma, suffer from PTSD, and so on and so forth. So now let's move on to the next section of the book about healing trauma. Before we get into part 2 about healing trauma, I think it's important to open with this preface. And this preface is something I've repeated many times in this video so far, but I'm going to repeat again because it's going to set the stage for everything that is to follow in the part 2 healing trauma section of the book and of the video. So here it goes. If you have not yet reached a stage where you would not be re-traumatized by revisiting the trauma experience in your mind, in therapy, and so on and so forth, it's important for you to not do so yet. And here's why. Because you don't want to be re-traumatized by revisiting that traumatic experience before you're not ready for it, which means if you're not yet at a stage where it would not overwhelm you and cause you a lot of stress and basically a lot of negative emotions. So that's why you have to wait until you're ready to revisit the trauma. But also that's why Bessel Van Der Kolk says that different methods of healing are needed and different approaches are required, because depending on the different stages of healing that people are in and different stages of how much revisiting their trauma is going to overwhelm them or not, depending on what stage of that process they're in, they're going to require different healing modalities and different treatments depending on what stage of that healing process they're in. So here's some notes on healing trauma. Some people get better using just one approach, but most people benefit from using different methods at different stages of their recovery. Another note is that recovery from trauma involves the restoration of executive functioning. And what executive functioning is a set of cognitive skills that help you plan, that help you focus, that help you remember and juggle tasks effectively. Another note is that as long as people are hyper aroused or shut down, which is what PTSD can cause in people, they have a hard time learning from experience. Another important note is that to heal trauma, we need to access the emotional brain. Now, this is probably the most major key to healing. Rebalancing the emotional and rational brains is the key to healing. So here's some other important points related to that previous point. The rational brain cannot abolish sensations, emotions, or thoughts. The next note is that through limbic system training, you can repair faulty alarm systems, which is what's out of whack in those who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and restoring them to their original functioning, which is the housekeeping of the body as a quiet background presence. And we can do that by the ways we breathe, chant, and move. So one of the healing modalities, for example, that's recommended highly in The Body Keeps the Score is yoga, because it involves both the breath and movement, for example. So going along with that last point, here's how mindfulness can help with PTSD. So the sympathetic nervous system controls the body's fight or flight response. And in those with PTSD, that response is firing wrong. So this response, the fight or flight response, which now they've added freeze to those three responses in those who are suffering from PTSD are not firing properly. So the fight or flight or freeze response are activated when they shouldn't be. So when there's no traumatic, stressful situation happening in the moment that would require one of those three responses of fight or flight or freeze, that system is still firing because it's working improperly in those who are suffering from PTSD. And mindfulness can help with that because it calms down the sympathetic nervous system, which regulates many body functions such as heart rate, breathing rate, pupil size, blood vessels, digestion, sweat production, glucose production, and airway muscles. Now, on to the next point. The real challenge of recovery is to reestablish control over yourself. And when we say yourself, in this case, we are specifically referring to your mind and your body. And the reason for that is trauma makes people feel either like somebody else or nobody. And that's why to overcome trauma, you need to get back in touch with your body, with yourself. The next point is that only by getting in touch with your body and connecting viscerally with yourself can you regain a sense of who you are, your priorities, and your values. And this is particularly apt, and this is not something that Bessel Van Der Kolk mentions in The Body Keeps the Score. This is just something I'm adding, a note that I'm making based on my understandings of the Enneagram personality typing system, which I love to study and share about. And I have a lot of videos on the Enneagram on my channel. But I believe this note is particularly apt for people who are either type 2s of the Enneagram or who are type 9s of the Enneagram. So just keep that in mind if you have some Enneagram understanding or knowledge. Connected to the last point, unfortunately, you have to revisit the trauma to regain control over yourself. And again, at the risk of belaboring this point to death, only once you're ready for it and won't be re-traumatized by it. And here's a summary on the healing part. The only way to change how we feel is by befriending what's going on inside ourselves. And in order to befriend what's going on inside ourselves, we first have to become aware of what's going on inside ourselves. Hey guys, I just want to jump back on here because I missed a few points that I want to add into this video. I think they're super important, and they're all about the healing modalities that Dr. Bessel Van Der Kolk discusses in The Body Keeps the Score. I forgot to mention some of these, so I wanted to jump back in and re-record this segment of the video a little bit to add these in because I think they're crucial, because this video is not, and this book is not just about understanding trauma, which is part of kind of what I enjoyed the most from reading this book, because I really had no idea how deep the impacts of trauma run and go within oneself, in our bodies, in our minds, and in our emotional body, and so on and so forth. So those are kind of like the parts that I found the most fascinating. And because these videos are so much about what my key takeaways from a book where I kind of had a bias towards focusing on that and not as much towards the healing, because that wasn't the part that I needed help with the most at the time. So that's why I kind of wanted to jump back in and discuss the parts about healing, because I think they're super helpful. So I will read something to you that I heard Bessel Van Der Kolk mention in an interview that I listened to recently with him. He said that basically the basis of all the healing modalities in the book, in The Body Keeps the Score, is to restore a sense of safety and focus inside. These were practically like exactly his words. So with that being our premise of the healing modalities, then I'm going to now jump in and talk about some of the different healing modalities that Bessel Van Der Kolk, and again, going back to an earlier point I mentioned in another part of the video, he has used and experimented with and utilized in his practice every single one of these healing modalities that he talks about in the book. So I'm going to go through some of those healing modalities and give you a little description of each. And I'm going to kind of add some in that I think are relevant or similar to those as well. So now basically based on that premise that we discussed and established, that like the basis of all healing modalities in the book is to restore a sense of safety and focus inside. Based on that premise, then it's safe to assume that all the healing modalities that we talk about, their goal is to help us feel safe and calm inside right now in this moment. And the best way to do that, the best ways to do that are through experiential techniques. And what I mean by that is basically things that are we experiment, we experience, we actually do and practice, not just like theory, not just thought, but actual practices. These are the things that help us the most, because so much of healing trauma, aka, even going back to the name of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, has to do with involving our body in the healing modalities, in the healing practice. So therefore, it's safe to assume and right to assume that you need to have experiential things that involve your body in the healing modality. So some of the things I'm going to list have that element to them. So here we go. Here's some things that to discuss. And healing modalities. So I'm going to read some things off of my notes because it's a lot and I don't want to miss anything. So here we go. Here's some healing modalities that Bessel Van Der Kolk mentions in the book. First and foremost is, meditation and mindfulness. These practices help increase awareness of the present moment, enabling trauma survivors to connect with their bodies, reduce stress, and manage symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Another one is breath work. I think someone who's like amazing at this is, and kind of known for this now, is Wim Hof, the Wim Hof breathing technique. So that's something you guys can look into. Another one is yoga. And yoga is phenomenal for people who have PTSD because it helps you calm your nervous system, calm your mind, calm your body, but basically also connect your breath. We just mentioned breath work, breath to movement, aka two parts that are crucial in healing trauma, because we talked about how you have to involve your body, then combining your breath and movement together is combining two of the key ingredients in the recipe of healing trauma, as Bessel Van Der Kolk puts it. Regarding the yoga that we mentioned, right? So trauma can be stored in the body, affecting our physical health. Practicing yoga and engaging in regular exercise can help reconnect the body and mind, relieve stress, and enhance self-regulation skills. So that's a little bit about yoga and just physical exercise as a whole. Sit up straight here, speaking of yoga. Next one is Qigong. Bessel Van Der Kolk briefly mentioned this, but the reason I want to talk about this is because I love Qigong. I practice Qigong. I have videos about Qigong on my channel. So you can check that out. And I'll also link my seafood, my teacher's channel. It's called Qigong of Tulsa in the description. I make the videos for that channel as well. And he, guides it and does the practices. So if you guys are interested in learning more about Qigong, we'll basically have that in the description. And then I'll encourage my seafood, my teacher, Mr. Tom Bowman, to also make a video potentially on, Qigong specifically for PTSD. So if you are interested in that, please let me know in the comments below, and we'll get that video out there for you. So next one is touch. So physical touch, basically like one of the healing practitioners in the book was saying something along the lines of like, people don't just thirst for like water and food, etc. We also can thirst for touch, and it's been proven that like babies that are not held as much and are not, basically held by their mother or father as much, it creates it has a significant impact on their development as a human being. It has lasting impact. That's how important touch can be. The next thing is chant. So if you guys have ever attended like a Hare Krishna, which is like a Hindu gathering, based on like the Hindu religion and the practices and the teachings of like the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas and so on and so forth. And if you have ever attended like a Hare Krishna chanting meeting or gathering and have, with the group I practice, like their, sect or religion was Bhakti yoga, it was called. And they do this like a Hare Krishna chant, which is like basically to them is repeating the name of God over and over again, but in a song and in a melody. And it's a very powerful thing where like it kind of not loses you, but like, yeah, it makes you lose yourself in the moment in a beautiful way, where you like are now involved in the chant and lost in the chant in a good way, where you're like, your mind is focused on that and you're like, you're let go in the moment and you're one with the moment and with the chant and with the group. And it's a very powerful and beautiful exercise. So highly recommend you guys check out one of, those Hare Krishna gatherings where they do the Hare Krishna chant, in your community, if you guys have that. So next one is dance. Dance can be very powerful. Ecstatic dance is become very popular as well, which is like dancing without any inhibitions, like not trying to like do a choreographed dance or anything like that, but just like really just letting go, allowing the energy and your body to move to the music, allowing the energy to move through you, so to speak. Another one is pray. So Desmond Tutu, which is a bishop, I think in Africa, Bessel Van Der Kolk apparently actually attended some of his like gatherings and stuff in Africa. And, they use prayer as also a way to move that energy and help people with trauma. Another one is art, practicing art, painting, drawing, acting, theater, so on and so forth. So like the theater and acting, he focused a lot on, because just being involved with a group, also actually like having to use your body, moving, etc. It's super helpful. And he really recommended that. But practicing art in general can be a great way to move that energy, to channel that energy in a beautiful and powerful way that can bring about healing. So that's something that he mentioned. Another one I want to add is like meditation with the whole body. So 2021, I came across this book. It was called Your Breathing Body. It's an audiobook on Audible. And basically this guy was talking about somatic meditation, like using your body in meditation. So meditation with the whole body. In a much, a few years ago, I made a video called like book recommendations for the Enneagram types. And I did recommend that book in particular, which was again called Your Breathing Body. It's an audiobook. And somatic meditation, using your body in the meditation, like his practices involve you laying down a lot and meditating, like feeling your senses, the ground, your body, your toes, your finger, like everything, feeling through that and involving your body in the meditation practice. That could be very helpful for trauma survivors. So moving on to the next one, I want to talk about this thing called the letting go technique. This is something I got from a book called Letting Go by Dr. David R. Hawkins. This used to be my most popular video on my channel. It got taken down due to a copyright issue, but it's back on my channel just without that copyright thing. It is the same. It's called the same thing, the letting go technique explained. And in that video, you can, learn about and hear about what Dr. David R. Hawkins talks about the letting go technique. The letting go technique is not something Bessel Van Der Kolk shared in the book, but it's something that I added because based on everything I took away from what he was talking about and things that are healing and helpful for trauma survivors, this completely fits the bill and fits that model and recipe that Bessel Van Der Kolk recommends. So I recommend you guys check that book out and my video out on that book if you guys are interested, and I think could be very helpful. It has been very helpful for a lot of people, including Russell Brand, who recommended it on his YouTube channel, and a lot of other people. So highly recommend checking that book out and checking my video out on it too if you're just are more interested in like a summary or a short version of that. Okay, moving on to the next one is I just wrote down like present moment, becoming aware of the present moment, becoming present. So one of the things that we mentioned, yoga is obviously helpful with that. Breath work is helpful with that. Chanting is helpful with that. Meditation, obviously helpful with that. But also a book that's very helpful with that is called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle that I highly recommend. And connecting to the present moment can be very helpful for those who are suffering from PTSD and its associated symptoms and so on and so forth. So going on into the next item on the list. So this might be a little bit controversial, but like not really if you like look at the studies, but it's psychedelic therapy. And I think Bessel Van Der Kolk briefly touches on this, but there's been a lot of studies done on the effectiveness on psychedelics when medically enforced and monitored and under the guidance of a physician, a healer, so on and so forth. Their effectiveness has been studied a lot in the recent years and has been shown to be tremendously powerful at healing trauma, helping trauma survivors, and so on. So it's hard to negate and their effect and not mention them in this list. Next one is hypnotherapy. This can be helpful. Another thing is EMDR. So EMDR is like this, it's like an eye movement tracking. I don't fully understand it, but I was watching this show on HBO recently called The Penguin, based on like the Batman movie that came out in 2022. And there was a scene in that, there was actually 2 scenes in that show. So if you guys want to check that out, I think it was episode 4 where, I don't want to add it because I don't want to get a copyright strike, but basically it was this red light that was moving across the screen, and the actress was like tracking it with her eyes, and it does something where like somehow doing this, like this eye movement, like tracking, can actually help you rewire and like your subconscious thoughts. I don't fully understand it or get it, but it's been, and even Bessel Van Der Kolk had his doubts about it initially, but once he saw its effectiveness, he was just amazed, and he talks about it in the book. So that's EMDR. I'll read a little bit about EMDR as he talks about it in the book. EMDR is a structured therapy that helps trauma survivors process and integrate distressing memories. By focusing on specific eye movements, EMDR assists in reprocessing traumatic events, allowing individuals to reduce the emotional impact. So that's it. That's pretty much all I want to recommend. You know, giving more healing modalities is not necessarily helpful. It's practicing the healing modalities that are already given that would bring the benefits of these practices. So I highly recommend you guys check out the book, check out these healing modalities, find YouTube videos on them, find books on them, and see what resonates, and go to a therapy aware practitioner, someone who can help you with these healing modalities. Because obviously I'm not an expert on any of these healing modalities, but obviously an expert who has practiced with all of these healing modalities, Bessel Van Der Kolk, swears by their effectiveness, especially at different stages of healing and depending on different needs of different people and where they are on their healing journey from traumatic past events. So if you want to help your healing journey of healing from the residues of past trauma, which is how Bessel Van Der Kolk approaches it and refers to it in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and you need more assistance and help with that, I think these healing modalities can help you. And now moving on to the rest of the video and going back to the previous edited part as I add this in to the new updated video. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of drugs in healing PTSD. Here's what Bessel Van Der Kolk says in The Body Keeps the Score about the role of drugs in treating trauma. He says that drugs cannot treat trauma. They can only dampen the expressions of a disturbed physiology, and they do not teach the lasting lessons of self-regulation. So here's a side note related to the role of drugs in healing PTSD that had me shaking my head, basically. Apparently, in some child psychiatrists' waiting rooms, there are Legos with the word Risperdal printed on them, which is an antipsychotic neuroleptic drug that they're prescribing to kids for PTSD and so on and so forth. And considering what we just learned from Bessel Van Der Kolk, that drugs do not help heal PTSD, then it makes no sense that they are prescribing these drugs to children, because they will only dampen their physiology and their ability to learn and so on and so forth, and cause cascading issues for them, and not teach them self-regulation, which is much more important and much more effective at healing trauma than the drugs ever are. So that was just something crazy that I learned in The Body Keeps the Score, and I could not share it with you. So to close out this video, I just want to say, if you are suffering from PTSD, if you're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, find a practitioner, which there are many highly qualified practitioners out there that could guide you through healing trauma and overcoming PTSD. And I encourage you to find them. And with books such as The Body Keeps the Score, they have been empowered and have knowledgeable tools to help you overcome that trauma. So I hope that this video was tremendously helpful for you, and that you go seek out this book, pick up this book if you're suffering from PTSD, and have it help guide you through it, and find practitioners in your area who could also guide you through it and help you through healing trauma if you're suffering from PTSD. So again, I hope that this video was helpful for you, and I hope to see you again very soon in my next video. Until then, take care and goodbye.